I am Ken Gould, Interim Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I just want to welcome everybody to the Robert L. Hess lecture this evening, part of our Scholar in Residence, Hess Scholar in Residence Week, named for our former president who left this endowment to us in order to promote important conversations about pressing issues, right, that are of relevance to the entire college community. And I think our experience this week thus far with Jose David Saldivar has proved to be exactly that, and as intended. I also want to thank the Hess Scholar in Residence Committee for making a terrific selection this year, and also for organizing a tremendous series of events on campus. And most notably, I want to thank Professor Rosamond King, the director of the Ethel Wolf Institute for the Humanities. Can we hear it for Rosamond? Who has done an awesome job with this week and with this series of events, and is doing an awesome and transformative job as director of the Wolf Institute, and is really making a difference on our campus and certainly in our School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and we are most appreciative. So with that, I will turn things over to Professor King.
Thank you, Dean Gould, not just for that introduction, but for your stalwart support of kind of anything intellectually rigorous on campus and anything that supports faculty and student success. So I also want to welcome you to this year's Robert L. Hess Memorial Lecture, sponsored by the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities. And Professor Jose David Saldivar will be introduced in detail by Vanessa Perez-Rosario. I want to say that I'm not happy that it's taken so long to have the first Latino Hess Scholar and to have the first scholar who is studying Latinx studies, but I'm happy to be here when that's happening, and I think we've really chosen a wonderful person to be part of that. If anyone's part of the committee, could you just raise your hand? It was really a group of people, and give them a hand, please, from departments across the college, and that's part of why we can have such a rich series of events happening. And Saklima Roy, could you also please raise your hand? She's the person who, yes. She is the programs director of the Wolf Institute, and after all the professors sit around and do our intellectual work, she actually makes things happen, orders the food, arranges for the security, arranges for the technology, et cetera. And so these events can't happen without her. And this week's events would not have happened without Professor Vanessa Perez-Rosario either. She provided one of the most comprehensive nominations for a Hess Scholar. Not only did she highlight his scholarship and his awards and his achievements, but she had it signed by professors from multiple departments. And so the committee knew that there was going to be support across the campus for having this scholar and his work here. And the Hess committee voted unanimously to have Jose David Saldivar here. So I'd like to introduce Professor Vanessa Perez-Rosario, who is also the 2018-2019 Wolf Faculty Fellow, and she is chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to introduce tonight the 2019 Hess Scholar in Residence, Dr. Jose David Saldivar, the Leon Sloss Jr. Professor of Comparative Literature at Stanford University. Professor Saldivar is a distinguished scholar in the fields of U.S., Latin American, and Latinx literary studies, whose work on border theory has been foundational to the field and instrumental in the shift towards trans-American studies. His first book, The Dialectics of Our America, Genealogy, Cultural Critique, and Literary History, published by Duke University Press in 1991, changed the conversation. The book is recognized as a foundation for a new field of inquiry that remaps the field of American cultural studies, fundamentally changing the way one reads both Latinx literature and the border. In his second book, Border Matters, Remapping American Cultural Studies, published by the University of California in 1997, Professor Saldivar calls into question the fixity of national borders by analyzing a broad range of cultural texts and practices, giving us a model for a new kind of U.S. cultural studies that challenges the homogeneity of U.S. nationalism and popular culture. In his third book, Transamericanity, Subaltern Modernities, Global Coloniality, and the Cultures of Greater Mexico, published by Duke University Press in 2012, Professor Saldivar advances his critical project of expanding the scope of American studies by arguing for a transnational, anti-national, and outer national paradigm for the field through the analysis of persistent motifs and literary themes in the imaginative literature of Latinx and Latin American writers. In the book, he advocates for an Americanity that opens up the idea of America with an accent to context well beyond the hemisphere. I would argue that the primary contribution that the field of Latinx literary studies has made to the world is our contribution in border theory. And that could not have happened without Professor Saldivar and his work. In addition to his published work, to these 3 books, he has a new book coming up, and he has published numerous articles and edited collections. As is the case with many distinguished scholars, Professor Saldivar's work is relevant across various fields and disciplines, as we've been able to witness this week in all of the different kinds of events that he's participated in. Pressing concerns around immigration, border security, and the wall are covered in the news daily. And we're so grateful to have Professor Saldivar with us this week to help us think through this awesome challenge. This evening, his talk is titled, Writing the U.S.-Mexico Border, Tearing Down the Wall. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Professor Perez Rosario and Professor Rosamond King. It's been a pleasure to be part of the Wolf Institute, and for all of the committee. I'm really appreciative and really honored by this invitation to come to Brooklyn College. It's been a busy week. I think I've had 3 events a day, but it's been very energizing, and I'm very excited to have gone through that. So as I said, I wanted to thank everyone for inviting me to Brooklyn College as the Robert Hess Scholar in Residence, and for giving me an opportunity to engage and discuss some of my newer work. I decided to try to write something new for this presentation today, but on a topic that I've written on the U.S.-Mexico border, and I'm currently teaching courses at Stanford on the U.S.-Mexico border. And so my work will discuss the frontera, the notions of coloniality and aesthetics. And it's been a pleasure to speak with the students and the faculty and the staff about all of this. So can people hear me? So let me see if I can get a slide. And I'm going to be showing some slides today to give you a better sense of what I'm talking about. And I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to turn on my timer so I can make sure that I try to do it in time. But I'm going to start in South Texas in Sector 1. This is a U.S. Homeland Security map of the U.S.-Mexico border. And so what I do is I teach writers from each of the regions to try to understand, well, what is it that they have in common? And then I'm going to move quickly to Ciudad Juarez and El Paso to talk about some work. And of course, I'm trying to end up in the last sector of Tijuana, San Diego, but I'm going to be talking about an artist from greater Tijuana, Los Angeles. So that's what more or less I'm doing today. So the late great Chilean writer, Roberto Bolaño, wrote in his speech called Discurso de Caracas, Caracas Discourse, and it was when he won the Romulo Gallegos Prize for his novel, The Savage Detectives, that, quote, a writer's homeland is his language. It is also the people he loves, and the courage to face the abyss and accepts what he finds. And so then he asks, so what's great literature? It's what it's always been. The same thing it's always been. The ability to peer into darkness, to leap into the void, to know that literature is danger, peligro. A dangerous undertaking. The ability to sprint along the edge of the precipice, to one side the bottomless abyss, and to the other, the faces you love. Literature is danger. And I just think that that's such a great definition of the work that many of us do in literary studies and why we teach literature. And the works that I'm looking at all have been influenced in some way by this notion of the power of the abyss on the one hand, the precipice, and the people we love in our languages. So I just wanted to kind of start there. So my presentation asks what's at stake in recent invocations of the US-Mexico border, writing and thinking. How do border frontera discourses represent experiences of displacement, of crossings, of constructing homes away from homes? And do they attain comparative scope while being rooted in very local specific histories and spaces? Do they offer resources for decolonial thinking and re-existence? So my presentation focuses on iconic and recent articulations of border literature and writing from Chicano and Chicana Mexican writers and artists, quest for non-exclusive practices of community, culture, and politics. So a few caveats are, I think, in order. My Hess lecture today has the strengths and the shortcomings of a very brief survey. I'm starting on one part and I move through the other. And in my course, I deal with many more writers that maybe you can ask me about. One sees the Hemingway-esque tips of many icebergs. Moreover, it attempts to map the US-Mexico border terrain from South Texas, Tamaulipas, and northern Mexico to Juarez, El Paso, and to the greater borderlands of Los Angeles, and define the stakes of what US border literature means in our times. In my Stanford seminar that I just completed on Friday, and so I was able to get to where I wanted to go in my class and finish my paper, Writing the US-Mexico Border, Tearing Down the Walls, I begin by having my students read the work of the anthropologist Jason De Leon and his book called The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail. And I do that just to give some context out of a literary context to see what the kind of work that activist anthropologists and ethnographers do. De Leon's ethnography looks at the US immigration policy from the 1980s to the present, partly. He employs a holistic anthropological approach combining forensic science, linguistics, critical ethnography, and archaeology. That's why he won the MacArthur last year. He has so many different expertises. In so doing, he paints how the human consequences of the US-Mexico border crossing experience are displayed in all their complexity. Rather than looking at the entirety border from South Texas to Tijuana, De Leon focuses on a specific area of the border, on the Sonoran Desert. So West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona is what his book focuses on, the Sonoran Desert on both sides of the border. So let me kind of see. So here we have a very recent picture of the crossings of workers and De Leon's work and what he's arguing. His main argument is that the Sonoran Desert is used as a tool of US border enforcement. The desert, he asserts, is a killing machine, end quote. A form of necroviolence that is at the heart of our government's policy called Prevention Through Deterrence Program. The Prevention Through Deterrence Program relies on the use of hypersecurity measures such as high border fencing, the walls, and I'll show the map again, but almost 80% of the border wall has been built. So it's already been built. And so Trump's billions of dollars is only for a short 500 miles that he's looking at. So it uses this hypersecurity measures such as border fencing, walls, and hundreds of Border Patrol agents on the ground in crossing areas around urban points of entry. The logic is that, quote, illegal traffic will be deterred or forced over more hostile terrain, less suited for crossing and more suited for enforcement, end quote. In practice for the last 25 years or so, the government's policy strategy has funneled millions of migrants toward places such as the Sonoran Desert of West Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. In that barren and unforgiving landscape, people seeking unauthorized entry walk for days while negotiating extreme weather conditions, venomous animals, rattlesnakes, and other dangers. Federal policymakers, De Leon argues, have relied on this quote-unquote hostile geographic conditions with the rattlesnakes and the coyotes, and ultimately the risk of dehydration and death to deter migrants, outsourcing border enforcement to nature. It's a powerful argument that De Leon is making. Much to the chagrin of US federal officials, prevention through deterrence has done little to stop migration. The policy has mainly succeeded in turning La Frontera, the border, into a dangerous and violent zone, a contact zone that occurs out of public view. And that's the point of the Prevention Through Deterrence program. Since 2000, more than hundreds of thousands of undocumented migrants have traversed the Arizona desert. The bodies of 2,900 people who have failed to survive this gauntlet have been recovered in Arizona in that same time period. Although it's widely believed, De Leon reminds us, that the actual number of migrants who have died en route is much higher. This intense necroviolence, and that is his term that he uses, is the theme of his book. The violence perpetrated in the Sonoran Desert, that is on both sides of the US-Mexico border, the stakeholders who benefit from this necroviolence, and the victims of the desert's destructiveness are all examined. Weaving together fieldwork in Arizona and Mexico, and pairing this with critical anthropological analysis, De Leon brings us close to the viciousness of this US policy. The histories of people most affected by the Sonoran Desert are also told through the book, The Land of Open Graves. For instance, and I won't go through the whole book, there is the tragic story of one of his subjects, the tragic story of Jose, a 15-year-old Ecuadorian boy raised by his grandparents. His parents immigrated without authorization to the United States when he was a young child, so they could make money and send it back to him. When Jose's girlfriend gets pregnant, he decides it's time to be a man, quote unquote, and try to support his soon-to-be family. He walks across the Sonoran Desert into Arizona, yet Jose doesn't make it and disappears. His body remains unfound even to today. So I think the point that De Leon is trying to make is that this story illuminates that the program is designed to be hidden. De Leon's paradigm of necroviolence is thus a political and social power used to dictate by our government how some people may live and how some people must die. So that's where I begin my course, and I think we have my students think about these new concepts of the border and the policies that our taxpayers are going to decide who lives and who dies in this context. Now, the first figure, I want to come back to the South Texas and the border. I'd now like to discuss the iconic work of the border, since I wasn't the one who invented it, the work actually of one of my students, the work of Gloria Anzaldua, who is best known for her book, Borderlands La Frontera, published in 1987. An innovative blend of self-reflective experience, history, historia, and feminist social protest with poetry and myth. Although Borderlands La Frontera resists traditional literary classification, scholars often described her book as a complex Bildungsroman, which is just a fancy term meaning the development of a narrative, the education of a narrative. A cultural narrative about her own coming into consciousness, into what she calls mestiza consciousness. When I first met and worked with Gloria Anzaldua at the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1990, when I was a young assistant professor, she asked me to help her prepare for her PhD qualifying exams in the literature program, and she enrolled in a tutorial with me in which we read a variety of Chicano and Chicana X literary books, from the anthropological work of Americo Paredes, his poetry and short stories he had written in the 1930s and 1940s, to the Chicano gay work of writers like John Recchi, his famous novel City of Night, that really is about New York gay scene, but it starts in El Paso and the border. And the work of my mentor at Stanford, Arturo Islas, who wrote a trilogy about El Paso in California, The Rain God, and the emergent writings by feminist Sandra Cisneros, Woman Hollering Creek, The House on Mango Street, Elena Viramontes, The Caribou Cafe, and the poetry of Lorna di Cervantes, Emplumada. And of course, we also read Anzaldua's own book, Borderlands La Frontera. I didn't realize at that time that I would be teaching and writing about her work for the next 30 years. And in every one of my books, I've tried to say something short about what her work does. But today I'm thinking, okay, I can say something more after teaching and talking about her work with my students. I distinctly recall Anzaldua describing her book as a new genre in planetary literature, what she called an auto-historia teoria, one word, auto-history theory. A new genre, and how many new genres have appeared in the last 75 years? I think we can count, maybe in two hands, the number of new genres. Maybe we can have a quiz and figure out which of the ones have been created. But this one is surely one of them, auto-historia teoria. One word, a genre, she said, that best described her interventions into and transformations of traditional Western autobiographical forms, and since we were at UC Santa Cruz, she was also studying with Hayden White, the medieval historian, notions of meta-history. Anzaldua's book was also performing a new analytic of what she calls, and Walter Mignolo, Latin Americanist, calls pensamiento fronterizo, bordered thinking, that included the writer's life story, a history of place, and situated knowledge along the US-Mexico border. And I can show her picture. By doing so, Anzaldua blended her cultural and personal biography with memoir, alluding to the work of Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, in which Woolf says, "As a woman, I have no country." This is a major theme of Anzaldua's work, and the work of Audre Lorde, that you can't take down the master's house with the master's tools. These are two of the theses of Anzaldua's writing, along with myth, history, queer theory, and forms of epistemological theorizing. But what exactly did Gloria Anzaldua mean by describing herself as a theorist? I mean, that's what all my students want to know. They all want to be theorists. What does that mean? In Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera, and in her posthumously published book, Luz en lo Oscuro, which was her dissertation that she didn't finish when she died, but has now been published, she held that we are all linguistic beings in How to Tame a Wild Tongue, and that our experience is structured like a language. For it is in our languaging practices that we become conceptually productive, which meant for Anzaldua that we not only think in language, but we also conceptualize in language. Concepts such as nepantla, a Nahuatl word meaning in-betweenness, la facultad, a kind of visionary notion of seeing and being, and the Coatlicue way, taking this goddess figure from Mesoamerican culture, that's both life and death, both male and female, both Eros and Thanatos, are not just logical operators in her text, but also figurations and symbologies that then double back and do conceptual work for her. Last, by auto-historia teoria, Anzaldua defined theory as a historicizing process. By turning to the pre-Columbian past and reading the Mexica's codices, their hieroglyphs, a writing without words, she became transmodern. Theory thus historicizes thought by studying its materializations across disparate forms of human experience. In her own case, that included border conjunto music from South Texas, pre-Columbian poetry, Chicano and Chicana writing, images like the mesquite trees that she writes about, the tree of life that she saw every day in her walks in UC at Santa Cruz, the winds from Abba Yala, and especially philosophy. She was a deeply philosophical thinker about aesthetics. All, I think, aspirational things. Anzaldua's ambitions in Borderlands La Frontera is to think all these things at once. And I think that's what I find kind of still remarkable in teaching her work. If Borderlands La Frontera is also crisscrossed by issues of affect, the economies of pain, wounds, and trauma, it's also inhabited by Anzaldua's feminist vision for social transformation and a call for the insurrection of border knowledges. At the center of her text and social activism, in fact, there are processes of what she calls re-existence and resignification, the best known of which is the revision of the border between Mexico and the United States. As the title suggests, Anzaldua focuses her analysis on La Frontera, and I'm going to focus on La Frontera and not on the first term, borderlands, because that's been much discussed. The dividing line between Mexico and the US that she desires to place at the very center of the US political and cultural scene. She introduces La Frontera through the metaphor of the bleeding wound, quote, and this is probably one of the most quoted sentences of her work. The US-Mexico border, she writes, es una herida abierta, is an open wound, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture, end quote. At the same time, Anzaldua proposed an overlapping of La Frontera with her own body and the bodies of mestizas, ripped apart and dismembered by the barbed wire fence along the Rio Grande River and the rest of the border. As she defines it, La Frontera is a 1,950-mile-long open wound dividing a pueblo, a culture running down the length of my body, staking fence rods in my flesh, and I think an allusion to her and Sherry Moraga's notion of theory in the flesh, splits me, me raja, me raja. This is my home, this thin edge of barbed wire, end quote. Just as the lands between Mexico and the United States are being torn up and continue to be torn up under our current president, so too Anzaldua's bodies and the bodies of mestizas are rajadas. Throughout her book, Anzaldua returns the unnatural boundary, the space of the border, to a historically decentered or multiply assembled, an assemblage, she calls it, a third space where, quote, the prohibited and the forbidden are its inhabitants. Los atravesados live here, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed. In short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal. For gringos in the Southwest consider the inhabitants of the borderlands transgressors, aliens, whether they possess documents or not, end quote. In the process, she breaks up the normalized notions of just normalization, first of all, but also of the normalized imagined community, introducing instead a third space and an experience, the migration and retorno of authorized and unauthorized Mexican populations in the periods of Ronald Reagan's wars in Central America, in other words, the time that she's writing her book in the 80s, and the US government's emergent necro-violence against Mexicans and indigenous peoples on both sides of the border. Over the 3 decades I've been teaching Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera, my students and I have been fascinated by her use of the metaphor of the open wound and her reference to her home as this thin edge of barbed wire. Now, the open wound, it seems to me, recalls the coloniality of US's imperial war with Mexico in 1846, 1848, and the subsequent United States annexation of a third of Mexican territory following the war and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So why did Anzaldua take this economy of pain, una herida abierta, as her starting point for a theory of agency and her coming into mestiza consciousness? A shock that propagated change, she writes. While I always felt that there is in Anzaldua's Autohistoria Teoria a close affiliation to Frantz Fanon's use of his psychic wounding on the streets of Leon, Paris, in black-skinned white masks, where he's hailed on the streets of Leon at the very moment when he's received his medical degree in psychiatry, and a young child interpolates him, hails him by calling him the N-word, and how Fanon then becomes crumbled by that act. I think there's something that Anzaldua is picking up on. So I recently taught feminist Alicia Schmidt Camacho's essay on what she calls migrant melancholia, in which she suggests that border crossing migrants to the US not only mourn the loss of their citizenship when they cross from either Central America or Mexico into the United States, but they also lose kinship, their relations with their families in Central America and Mexico. And most important for Anzaldua, they lose their dignidad, they lose their dignity when they cross without an authorization. But they also internalize the pain of losing the love object and entering into the border condition of melancholia. And it was, of course, Sigmund Freud. I was just teaching his essay last week on mourning and melancholia in 1917, where he defined the complex of melancholia in contrast to a normal human activity of mourning as, quote, behaving like an open wound, end quote. So I see already a genealogy in Anzaldua's work from Freud, psychoanalysis, to Fanon, and this hemorrhaging of a lot of black blood on the streets of Leon, Paris, to her own notion of the open wound. In one of the key chapters of Borderlands La Frontera, La Herencia de Coatlicue, the Coatlicue state, Anzaldua sees her dark, prieta body reflected in obsidian, a mirror that sends her back to her many faces and her many names that she's been hailed by in South Texas. Gauri, La Prieta, Gloria, Tonantzin, Coatlicue, La Chingada, it goes on, all of the many names that she's been interpolated by. Anzaldua's images of the mirror introduce us to seeing herself as both an object and subject of vision, of seeing and being seen on La Frontera. It's a gaze that judges and paralyzes her, she says. So she then gives us a journey into herself, which is a descent into Mictlan, which is an inframundo, the world of the Mexicas' land of the dead. So there is a sense of descending into this intense pessimism that I'm seeing in Anzaldua's work. And so it's a descent into Mictlan, the Mexicas' inframundo of the dead, into what she calls the Coatlicue state. Is thus a journey into death and leaves her with feelings of agony and inadequacy. That is, by being an object of a dominant gaze that splits her, that wounds her, that cracks her identity. She's repudiated, she says, parts of herself that her heteronormative Catholic family has placed on her, by the Catholic Church, by the public schools and the university that have all rejected who she is. And she used coraje, anger, to drive others away. But the I in this chapter slides into the we. She writes, "We Chicanas blame ourselves, terrorize ourselves. We only know that we are hurting," end quote. At the end of her descent into this mouth of the abyss, as she calls it, she finds a mirror, a volcanic obsidian glass, used by the Mexicas to predict the future. She's therefore forced to confront her own face and the face of the other. Quote, "When I reach bottom, something forces me to push up," she writes, "walk toward the mirror. But I dig in my heels. Behind the mask of ice, I see my own eyes," end quote. Briefly, with this encounter with herself in this perilous contact zone of the dead, Anzaldua gains an increase of border consciousness that she defines as a travesía, a crossing. Border riding thus involves danger, peligro, as I started with Bolaño's thesis. A descent into the abyss, a dislocation, and crossing that marks her sense of re-existence. Quote, "You are no longer the person you were, and there is no turning back. No hay más que cambiar," end quote. And the chapter concludes with one of the richest descriptions of her new bodily sensation, in other words, of aesthetics, of re-existence. Quote, "A delicious caving into myself," end quote. And suddenly she writes, quote, "I feel everything rushing to a center. All the lost pieces of myself come flying from the deserts and the mountains and the valleys, magnetized toward the center, completa." When I taught at Duke, I had the opportunity to host Professor Toni Morrison, and she had just published her novel, her prequel to Beloved, and she told me that she had been influenced by Anzaldua's through her character Sorrow. And so, those of you who read A Mercy know that Morrison it's one of the most incredible novels of the 21st century because she's going back to the founding of the Virginia colony, but it's the most I think, multicultural work that we've seen in a long time. If Anzaldua's specific map, History and Borderlands La Frontera, is open to amendment and critical judgment, and all our work certainly is, for skewing Chicanos and Chicanas in the direction of a pre-contact world with their ideas of Nepantla and Mictlan at its center, or for focusing on the practices of writing a Bildungsroman of consciousness, a la Hegel. I mean, when I teach the phenomenology of spirit by Hegel, there is an interesting resonance to how do we come into consciousness. Or when we teach Frantz Fanon's Hemorrhaging of Black Blood on the Streets of Leon in Black Skin, White Mass. For me, Anzaldua's theorizing of the border, its boundaries and places of cultural zones of contact, Nepantla, provides more theoretical insights than I have space here today to fully develop. But let me just mention a few before I move on. On the one hand, Anzaldua redoubles reinscription of Spanish and Chicano Spanish, a third world languaging practice, into English, a first world languaging practice, by stressing the difficulties of what she calls taming a wild tongue. This is a recast by Anzaldua as a strategy of re-existence. I've now quit using the term resistance because I get always, is everything resistance, Jose? No, but everything is re-existence, a much more interesting concept that we get from Native American studies. On the other hand, Anzaldua reinscribes the Mexica's concepts of writing and painting, of the codices, the red ink and the black ink. And by so doing, she contests the Eurocentric theorists by denying that writing is a representation of sound and that languages are bound by one territory. Last but not least, the links Anzaldua establishes between gender and language allows for the displacements of geocultural concepts, such as the United States of America, of Nuestra America, our America, Hispanic America, as far as all these concepts are founded in and by discursive formations presupposing heteronormativity, masculinity, patriarchy as the constitutional subject of cultural categories. Instead, Anzaldua displaces the accent from the delimitation of geographical spaces to their fronteras, to their borders, locations in which languages, Spanish, Spanglish, Quechua, Nahuatl, English, and gender, male, female, heterosexual, queer, are the conditions of possibility for the creation of spaces of in-betweenness as a different way of thinking otherwise. So one of the great theoretical contributions in Anzaldua's Autohistoria Teoria is her creation of a space of in-betweenness, from where to think, rather than a hybrid space to talk about. A Nepantla thinking space of La Frontera as a condition of possibility for decolonial theorizing. But before Anzaldua can invoke the consciousness of La Nueva Mestiza, she must first redefine it, wrench it open, tear down its walls. To be a mujer in this space is to traverse una herida abierta that cannot heal. Even if scars form, the festering is ever below. I now want to move quickly to this is a great representation by the writer Arturo Ledesma from his book, Diary of an Unrecognized Dreamer. And he basically talks about how important it was for Gloria Anzaldua to read her and to think about how she's redefining the paradigm of epistemology in his work. And this is a picture of what Gloria Anzaldua sees in New York City when she comes to the Museum of Natural History and sees the Coatlicue that was uncovered in 1968 when the Mexican government was building their underground subway system. And this becomes a central image in her work. So I want to come back here. So I'm moving quickly from South Texas to El Paso, Ciudad Juarez with the next example. I now want to move from South Texas and northern Mexico, Tamaulipas, and center on Yuri Herrera's Mexican novel entitled Señales que Presidan al Fin del Mundo, published in 2009, Signs Preceding the End of the World, where elderly men, dogs, and cars get swallowed up at the beginning of the novel into a subtly gaping tierra, earth. Young men and women cross the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo, between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, and the river is filled with green water monsters. And narco-drug traffickers, duros, resemble reptile in pants. So obviously it's a fable, a fabula, and it's a sci-fi fabula that Herrera is giving us. The title gives it away, science preceding the end of the world, at the end of the apocalyptic world, as he puts it. Although not linked directly to Anzaldua's book, Borderlands, and coming into consciousness via her descent into Mictlan, an underworld of the dead, Herrera's book creates a world of crisis and re-existence. A Mexico-US border in which the unreachable, allá aquí, the here, and the allá, the over there, are somehow put together in Herrera's work. And I want to thank my student Josh Kuhn for writing about the here and the there in his amazing work that he's doing on music. So, a secular beyond mundo, beyond world, that plays in counterpoint to the hard flesh and blood present. Herrera's protagonist, a young woman named Máquina, remains cool and hard-boiled throughout the novel, with Herrera blending unreal narco-drug aesthetics, duros and thugs and coyotes and polleros, with savvy wit of hard-boiled detective fiction of Roberto Bolaño, Jorge Luis Borges, and Raymond Chandler, to create a frontera noir style all his own. On the surface, Herrera writes about Mexicans and Chicanos along the US-Mexico border between Mexico, his home, he was born in the state of Jalisco, and the United States, his new home. I first met Yuri Herrera when he was finishing his PhD at Berkeley, and he was writing a story about colonial history in Mexico. He currently teaches creative writing at Tulane University. Inspired, no doubt, from his time as an MFA graduate student at the University of Texas, El Paso, where he first gets to know the ins and outs of Ciudad Juarez. And I should mention, the reason he went to do his MFA there, because it was the first bilingual MFA program in the United States. Like Anzaldua's book, Herrera's real subject in Señales is the border life or the border condition, a pensamiento fronterizo, and his real subject is this state of in-betweenness, an existence between aquí and allá, this side of Mexico and the other side of the Rio Grande, narco and border patrol, authorized and unauthorized citizens, between life and death. Quote, vaya, lleve este papel a su hermano, the novel begins. Go and take this paper to your brother. This is how Herrera's quest narrative begins. Sent on an errand, a mandado by her mother Corra, from Mexico's south into the north, Máquina journeys from her little village to the little town and to the big Chilango, in other words, Mexico City. But before she marchas, Herrera writes, Máquina is instructed by her mother to go talk to the local village's narco top dogs, Mr. W and Mr. H, from the criminal world, and to make nice, end quote. They owe Cora favors, for she'd once hidden them from authorities. Make nice, Máquina does, and they collectively lend a hand in helping her with her trip to the north, and they hire a guide, a pollero, Chucho, who gets her across the Rio Grande. Immediately, Herrera writes, we're in the hustle, end quote. And Máquina negotiates this hard-boiled, sinister world of opportunistic drug lords, of perros, of dogs, of coyotes, of the border patrol, and the narco lords, Mr. H and W. In return for smuggling a paquete of contraband, probably heroin, wrapped in gold cloth, quote, just big enough to hold a couple of tamales, end quote, across the border, they help Máquina succeed on her epic journey from the here to the there. Máquina journeys by bus, where she's pawed and ogled by local young boys, hardly more than kids with peach fuzz, all the way to the big Chilango, and then she takes another bus to Mexico's border, to the end of the world, to the Rio Grande River, finally crossing in an inner tube with her guide, the roiling green river, with monsters, and running the harsh desert gauntlet of people, pollos and coyotes. Later, in rushing to find her brother on the other side of the border, Máquina flies like a great voladera, a diosa, a goddess, a curandera, a healer. As she felt, Herrera writes, quote, her feet not touching the ground, as if she could float, end quote. Machina also repels bullets, one from a racist patriot rancher's revolver. The bullet enters her side, but it harchares exit between her two wounds and her two ribs. Machina's invincibility is grounded by a savvy flair for handling herself in a world of brutal predators, of the Border Patrol and police, where men are defined by their weapons as Thug 45 or Thug 38. Throughout Herrera's Sonoran desert frontera, it bears traces of its daily apocalypse. And Machina comes across Mexican migrant paisanos, their discarded rucksacks, their backpacks crammed with time, with amulets, letters, sometimes a huapango violin, a photo. And I just want to show some photos. This is the way the novel looks like. And Francisco Goldman said that young Yuri Herrera is the best novelist of Mexico of the last 25 years. Very heady blurb. And this is Herrera himself. But this is all the backpacks that the anthropologist, Jason De Leon, has found, and he's now displayed them in a museum. They remind me of all the shoes from the Holocaust that we see. And this is exactly what Herrera is describing in his work. In one of the novel's most necroviolent scenes, Machina thinks she sees a pregnant woman resting under a tree, and she says, wow, how welcoming to the United States. But worse, it turns out to be, quote, a poor wretch, swollen with putrefaction, his eyes and tongue pecked out by buzzards, end quote. This is the apocalypse or violent inframundo Herrera's novel unveils for us. In fact, that's the root of apocalypse, an unveiling, a revelation that we know, both in the Bible and in our Hollywood blockbuster movies. Herrera's Señales is therefore a book of layered movements, of dangerous border crossings, and all of this plays into the feelings of unsettledness in the novel. The presence of constantly moving about is the very language that Herrera uses. In his translator's note, Lisa Dillman, for instance, notes that details this in her translation of Herrera's word, harchar, which is a word that comes from Arabic and in Spanish, the ending of a couplet in poetry of the time, as a version of leaving. So the translator translates harchar as versing. So Machina is always versing down the mean streets of La Frontera. When Machina verses, as she often does, she is leaving a situation, but with a sense of a linguistic locus of enunciation, a poetic bridging from one moment to another, more than a physical departure, more than an ending. Machina's quest is a wondrous deciphering of the world, a diligent search over the entire surface of the border, transforming the world into señales. I recently invited Yuri Herrera to Stanford, and he was asked to read his favorite part of the novel. The students wanted him to read the most political part of the novel, but instead he reads from this, and is that okay if I play it? Yeah? It's 2 minutes. Let's see if I can do this. This is the world of mi clan.
Hablan una lengua intermedia con la que Martina simpatiza de inmediato, porque es como ella, maleable, inerte, permeable. Un golpe entre dos semejantes distantes y luego entre otros dos y luego entre otros dos, no es exactamente lo mismo, un algo que sirve para poner relación. Más que un punto medio entre lo paisano y lo gabacho, su lengua es una franja difusa entre lo que desaparece y lo que no ha nacido, pero no una hecatombe. Machina no percibe en su lengua ninguna ausencia súbita, sino una metamorfosis sagaz, una mudanza en defensa propia. Pueden estar hablando en perfecta lengua latina y sin prevenir a nadie empiezan a hablar en perfecta lengua gabacha, y así pueden mantenerse entre cosa que se cree perfecta y cosa que se cree perfecta, transfigurándose entre dos animales, hasta que por descuido o por clarísima intención, de pronto dejan de alternar lenguas y hablan en esa otra. En ello brota la nostalgia de la tierra que dejaron o no conocieron, cuando usan las palabras con las que se nombran objetos. Las acciones las mientan usando un verbo gabacho que es ejecutado a la manera latina, con la colita sonora de ella. Al usar en una lengua la palabra que sirve para eso en la otra, resuenan los atributos de una y de la otra. Si uno dice dame fuego, cuando ellos dicen dame una luz, ¿qué no se aprende sobre el fuego, la luz y sobre el acto de dar? No es que sea otra manera de hablar de las cosas, son cosas nuevas. Es el mundo sucediendo nuevamente, advierte Maquina, prometiendo otras cosas, significando otras cosas, produciendo objetos distintos. Quién sabe si durarán, quién sabe si sus nombres serán aceptados por todos, piensan, pero ahí están, dando vida. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just read a little part of it in translation. More than the midpoint between homegrown and Anglo, their tongue is a nebulous territory between what is dying out and what is not yet born, but not a hecatomb. Machina senses in their tongue, not a sudden absence, but a shrewd metamorphosis, a self-defensive shift. They may be talking in perfect Latin tongue, in other words, Spanish, and without warning, begin to talk in perfect Anglo tongue, lengua gabacho, and keep it up like that, alternating between a thing that believes itself to be a perfect and a thing that believes itself to be perfect, morphing back and forth between two beasts until, out of carelessness or a clear intent, they suddenly stop switching tongues and start speaking the other one. In it brims nostalgia for the land they left or never knew when they used words with which they name objects, which actions are alluded to with an Anglo verb conjugated Latin style. Pining on a sonorous tale from back there. Using in one thing the word for a thing, and the other makes the attributes both resound. If you say, give me fire, when they say, give me a light, what is not to be learned about fire, light, and the act of giving? I think it's a wonderful treatise on his poetics and his notion of words and things, and the gap, the bracket between the sign and the signified. He actually did his PhD at Berkeley. Although Machina travels light, intent on coming right back for her younger sister in Mexico and for her mother, the United States of America is a deadly siren call. Faced with shedding her name, her home, and her tongue, Machina whispers to herself, me han desollado, I've been skinned. Like Anzaldua's coming into consciousness, completa, Machina sees that her paisaje was not a cataclysm, but with all of her body and all of her memories, she truly understands that she's now lista, ready for the ending of the world. Both Gloria Anzaldua and Yuri Herrera revealed themselves in Borderlands, La Frontera, and Señales to be nimble giants, far taller than the tallest walls that Trump desires to build. And now I'll conclude by turning to my last. I do want to end in the long border picture of the protests against Trump's wall in Ciudad Juarez. Tijuana, we finally get to Tijuana. But I want to talk about an artist that I've been showing throughout my presentation. Throughout my lecture today, I've been using in some of my PowerPoint slides some of the life-sized cardboard paintings and cutouts of migrant border crossers buried in the open graves in the Sonoran, Arizonan desert. Cutouts of migrant gardeners, housekeepers, jornaleros, workers, by the Chicano artist Ramiro Gomez, who in his public art installations all over Los Angeles, Hollywood, and Beverly Hills, on streets, parks, and in front of culture industry studios, has bringing to our attention what he calls the invisible workers of the California borderland. These workers are mainly Mexican and Central American and Chicano workers who help raise the children of wealthy families and maintain their homes, the lush gardens, and the pools of the white residents. And I'll quickly kind of go through some of these. And here we have Paramount Studios, and what he does is put the paper cutout of the worker doing all of the work. Or this one in front of the Tony Beverly Hills Hotel. Over here he has his paper cutout of the worker that he's bringing there. Or other installations. His work is now moved from the freeways and the homes to inside museums. Here's another one of Melrose Place. And I guess my favorite is what he's doing with paintings by David Hockney. And David Hockney has really appreciated what Ramiro Gomez is doing, and they're collaborating now in some of the more recent work that they're doing. These workers are, as I said, Mexican, Central American, and Chicano workers who help raise the children of wealthy families. Why, Gomez asked, do these Mexican workers go so unseen? After all, they uphold our culture and society on their backs and in their hard work so that the wealthy families can go on with their lives. Gomez himself is a son of Mexican unauthorized immigrants, born and raised in San Bernardino, and he's been painting in Los Angeles over the past 5 years. He starts by painting images of Mexican day laborers and nannies onto recycled cardboard that he gets at the local Best Buy stores, then collects them and places them in front of Hollywood studios, busy street intersections, and these rich homes. The idea for his art project stemmed largely, he says, from his own experiences in Hollywood working as a nanny. He painted nannies like himself, the caregivers that started a conversation in Los Angeles about the workers' very invisibility. For instance, when former President Barack Obama visited Hollywood actor George Clooney's mansion for a fundraiser, Gomez put his cut-out painting entitled, "We Are All American." So this is what he placed in front of the mansion of Clooney's, and immediately the Secret Service removed it. The Secret Service, however, quickly took them down, and Gomez claims that his cardboard cutout art was meant to be a political provocation. But he's not sure if President Obama ever saw them. I think he should send them to Trump. I think that would be best. So to conclude, I want to look briefly at one of Gomez's paintings entitled Las Meninas, Beverly Hills, which is one of my favorite work that he does. I mean, everybody's aware that this comes from the very famous painting by Diego Velázquez, Las Meninas. And I'm still, I'm not an art historian, so I'm still trying to make my way. So any reflections you have on what Gomez is doing, I'd really be appreciative. And I talked to Ito yesterday in art installation. He gave me a lot of leads of what I should be thinking about. As we know, Las Meninas in Spanish refers to the young girls in waiting who served in King Philip IV's royal court. Young girls, nannies in waiting, that Diego Velázquez memorialized in his painting called Las Meninas of 1656. So this is a figure that it takes out. It's a wonderful painting. Velázquez giving a kind of, a self-portrait, the court of the king and queen, the daughter, La Infanta. Figures of light and darkness, that's all over the painting. And then we get the power knowledge couplet of the king and queen reflected in a mirror. We can't see them. They exceed the frame of Velázquez. But why did Gomez resignify Velázquez's iconic painting by taking one of Velázquez's central figures of La Infanta and relocating a life-size cutout painting with her two anonymous Mexican nannies or meninas in waiting? So I was just at the Prado this summer, and it's an amazing painting. I can go and stand in front of the painting and try to figure out what I find remarkable. And it was amazing to let me take a photo, because you're not, I told them, well, I'm writing an essay. And this is what I'm trying to think about then in both of these paintings. Like the master Velázquez, did Ramiro Gomez want to continue exploring the fascinating shift in the grid of power and knowledge from, say, the Renaissance to the Age Classique that Velázquez illustrated in his painting? As we know, Velázquez's painting, Las Meninas, occupies an essential place in the history of Western art, of visual culture, not only because Velázquez revealed a new way of organizing and understanding knowledge as it was taking hold at the time, but rather than being a direct expression of the world, knowledge and power were composed as a network or grid of meaning that artists like Velázquez mapped down to the world, and that meaning was of our own making. Like Velázquez's Las Meninas, Gomez's painting Las Meninas, Beverly Hills, is itself a new kind of organization of knowledge, a pensamiento fronterizo, and seeing our world. Like Velázquez's work, Gomez's painting too takes the form of a grid of identities, Mexican nannies, and the colonial differences that can be used to navigate our world. This is how we can see within Velázquez's Las Meninas, how his painting within the painting separates two realities, as though the painter could not at the same time be seen on the picture where he's represented, and also see that upon which he is representing something. Velázquez, and I think Gomez is commenting on this in his painting, is at the threshold of two incompatible visibilities. And I'm quoting Michel Foucault because that's how he begins his reading of The Order of Things with his amazing analysis of Las Meninas. And I've been inspired by Foucault's reading. Two incompatible visibilities. What an amazing suggestive formulation for understanding the two Meninas. As we can see in Gomez's painting, if the visibilities of caring for La Infanta are never hidden, they are nevertheless not immediately seen or visible. In fact, Gomez's nannies are anonymous, faceless, eyeless, kneeling in a poise of servitude. They are invisible so long as we consider them not as subjects, but as things and not the conditions which open them up. If Las Meninas by Velázquez and Gomez are both systems of light that distribute the light and the dark, the opaque and the transparent, the seen and the not seen, they both are opening new spaces of representation and distributing what's seen and who sees, the exchanges, the feints, and reflections. For if Velázquez's power or King Philip IV can only be inferred as existing outside the painting, what is it that Gomez's Las Meninas is asking us to see? Visibilities and Velázquez's and Gomez's paintings are not defined by sight alone, but are complexes of actions and passions, multisensorial complexes which emerge into the light of day. Both Velázquez's age and Gomez's in our own age see and reveal all they can within the conditions laid down for visibility. Nothing is ever secret. The fact that Mexican nannies and workers in Los Angeles fronteras are invisible, even though nothing is even ever more immediately visible or readable. So thank you. Thank you. I did it within 15 minutes. So I had to rush from South Texas to Los Angeles.
You made it all the way?
I made it all the way.
You made it all the way. Thank you so much. I realized that we had not had a land acknowledgement at the beginning. But of course, it's never too late to do a land acknowledgement. We are on the land of the Canarsie and the Nyack people, who are subgroups of the Lenape people, and of course on land that has also been enriched by the labor and the blood of enslaved Africans. I'm also thinking about that in part because you've managed to bring a Chicanics presence into your talk, which we often, as you know, absorb Chicanics into Latino in New York City, right?
You gave me very specific instructions of what I should do.
Yeah, so there's a Chicanics presence as well as an indigenous presence, right? As well as a female presence, a queer presence, and a really truly interdisciplinary talk that touches on anthropology, literature, the auto historia teorías, visual art. And one of the things that I was thinking of is that also, when we think of the land that we are on and the context of the land that we are on, according to Homeland Security, all of New York City is part of the border.
Right.
Right, and as some of you may know, if you are in any kind of train station or bus station or airport in New York City, they can ask you for your ID at any time, right, to prove your right to be here. So I think that we are also, of course, part of the Intramundo.
That's right. We're part of all of this descent into the abyss.
Right, exactly, and so we can come out of the abyss, though. We do have hope.
We can.
So
That's all it does.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah, so I really appreciate that. And I do want Professor Saldivar mentioned the art installation that is happening, and it's by Whitehead, so it's going to be up for a few weeks. It's a little rainy now, it's still there, so you can stop by now, but it's going to be up for a few weeks, and I do encourage you to see it. It's in your booklet. It's called Woven. Stories make the fabric, and so there are these large looms, and the students have encouraged us to weave through stories of immigration and diversity and the world that we're living in today. What we're going to do is we're actually not going to take questions, but I'm going to encourage all of you to walk with us across the street to Subo. We're going to the 5th floor where we have dinner for everyone. Even if you can only stay for a few minutes, I encourage you to come. And that's where we're going to continue the conversations.